So of the different cultural groups we talk about when we look at the ancient Aegean, the third of these, the last one we're going to really talk about is the Mycenaeans. Before we talk about the Mycenaeans, though, we're going to talk about their ancient enemies, and that, of course, is the Trojans. In order for us to really talk about the Trojans and about the ancient city of Troy, we're going to begin by looking at one guy. His name was Heinrich Schliemann. So Schliemann was a German who in 1870 discovered the location, the site that we today believe is the city of Troy. He didn't actually really discover the place. There was another archaeologist who kind of pointed him out to it and said, hey, I think that might be it. And it fit all of the clues and descriptions that he had really kind of built up and had accumulated through his studies. And he excavated the place, and sure enough, it turns out that this site called Hisarlik appears to be the remains of the ancient legendary city of Troy. Now, a little bit about Schliemann and about why he did this and why he chose to go after the city. Well, when he was a young boy, he was working as a grocer, and he was really very poor. But a sailor comes in, and so this sailor begins to recite the Iliad, and he's doing it verbatim, and the sailor is also quite drunk. But he's just reciting the poem, just, the whole thing. And so Schliemann ends up, even though he's quite poor, buys the guy another drink and keeps buying him drinks to get him to continue to recite the poem. And he's just completely taken with this. And so this was the beginning of really an obsession with the Homeric epics, with the Iliad and the Odyssey. And prior to this period in history, people were quite familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they were simply believed to be great works of fiction. They were poems, but there was no belief at all that there was any kind of grain of truth in these. They were all just stories. Well, Schliemann, for some reason, decides that these stories aren't mythology, that they're history, that they're true. And so he sets about focusing all of his energy. He devotes his life to proving that the Homeric epics are fact. So in order to do this, he realizes he's going to need some resources. He has to educate himself. He has to become quite wealthy. So he ends up going about mastering like more than a dozen languages, and makes quite a bit of money and becomes quite wealthy, primarily working as a translator. But he becomes a very powerful man and becomes a very well-educated man. And then finally, he travels. He goes to Turkey. He finds this site at Hisarlik, excavates in a quite brutal manner, by the way. His techniques and processes would be considered absolutely abhorrent by today's expectations for archaeology. He basically digs an enormous trench straight through the city. But when he does this, he finds almost, if you will, a layered cake of civilizations. He finds these very, very early remains of a city all the way up to the last level. And in one of these, called Troy 7, he finds the remains of a burned city, which would have been contemporaneous with the period in history that he was looking at. Everything matches. And so we believe today that this site that he found, also substantiated by the artifacts that he locates, we believe that this place is in fact the legendary city of Troy. One of the things that he finds there is a tremendous wealth of gold, something called Priam's treasure, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So this image here, you can see the gentleman here in the top hat and fur coat. Well, this is him. This is Heinrich Schliemann himself. And so, as is somewhat evidenced by the photo here, he became quite wealthy. He also became quite notorious. He had a tendency to do what he did without always seeking appropriate approvals, and he was also well known for essentially stealing the artifacts that he discovered rather than turning them over to the appropriate authorities or the governments of the places where he worked. This aerial view here shows you the excavation at the site of Hisarlik. And you can see, get some idea of the scale and size of the walls, and get an idea what the structure looks like today. We see the remains of a theater. We can also see, again, walls that may have been intended to be fortified. But it appears to be a fairly sophisticated city. In the next image here, we get another idea of what this location may have looked like. And again, this model shows us that it does indeed fit the bill. This is quite parallel, really, with the descriptions that we would expect to see when we're talking about the Iliad and the Odyssey. An image here, this is his first trench, and as you can see, he just digs straight through the hill. Now, in addition to finding the foundations of the buildings, he did also find some interesting artifacts. Here you can see, by the way, the gateway, the southwest gate of Troy, leading up into the structure. So this black and white photograph here is of something called Priam's treasure. And the story goes that essentially Schliemann had his guys working, digging in the trenches one day, digging through the city, and he himself sees the glint of gold, and nobody else catches it. Nobody else knows it's there. Well, he makes a big announcement and tells everybody, he says, "Hey, it's my wife's birthday. Everybody go home." And Schliemann had actually managed to, he had married a Greek girl. She was, really kind of his version of Helen, I guess you could say. And then, after he sends everybody home by claiming it's her birthday, he then personally goes down to the trench, starts to dig, and sure enough finds a chest full of all sorts of rich gold objects. So he assumes immediately that what he's looking at is, in fact, the lost treasure of King Priam from the Iliad. And in this image here, you can see he decks his wife out, wearing all sorts of jewelry, these gold, beautiful items that he had discovered, found within this trench. So the treasure was, never stayed in Turkish hands, though. He, rather than admitting to the authorities that he found this, he quietly packs it all up and gets the heck out of Dodge. He returns to Germany with this treasure in hand, and of course the Turkish government is irate about this. But he just takes the gold and runs, really. Now, ironically, though, this treasure vanishes in 1944. And the reason why is because what ends up for a long time we didn't know. It was just gone. It was in Germany prior to World War II, and then after World War II, it wasn't there anymore. And a lot of people assumed that it was gone, it had been destroyed, but it actually turned up, not that many years ago, actually, but I think within the last decade, was discovered warehoused in a museum in Russia. So when the Russians came through, through Germany at the end of World War II, picking up all sorts of artistic goodies and hauling them back, it appears that Priam's treasure was one of these items that was liberated by the Russians and taken back to be stored essentially in a warehouse for 60, 70 years. So having a little bit of background on the Trojans, this brings us to the ancient Mycenaeans. So after Schliemann discovers the city of Troy, he decides, well, if I have found the Trojans, it's time for me to find the Greeks. And by the way, when we talk about the Greeks today, and we think about the classical Greeks, these are actually a different people in terms of their heredity, their genealogy, as compared to the Mycenaeans. The classical Greeks that we think of immigrated into the Hellenic Peninsula later, after the fall of the Mycenaean civilization. But these Mycenaeans included some people who were really quite famous in the ancient mythologies, including, of course, Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, and all sorts of others that supposedly resided in these massive walled cities in the Hellenic Peninsula. And so Schliemann decides that he is going to find the ancient city of Mycenae. He's going to find the home of Agamemnon. And when he begins his excavations, sure enough, he finds these massive fortified citadels. The stonework that we see at these places, it's a technique, a process that today we refer to as Cyclopean masonry. And this comes from the word cyclops. And the reason why is because the structures are built with these enormous, monstrous blocks of stone. These blocks of stone are so big that the later Greeks were unable to really reconcile how these structures had been built. And so they assumed that they weren't built by normal human mortal people, but in fact had been built by a race of Cyclops. And so we refer again to these today as Cyclopean masonry. So an example of that can be seen here at the Citadel of Tiryns in Greece. And this dates roughly to 1400 to 1200 BCE. So one of the things you really have to look at when you look at the Citadel at Tiryns is I want you to look at it and think about it from a military point of view. So the Citadel, as you can see, is up on a substantial hill. And then I want you to look at the thickness of the walls. Many of these walls, by the way, they average 20 feet thick. They're made of massive rough-cut stone. So one of the things you have to do when you look at this is you have to kind of visualize, what kind of lifestyle do these people have? What was this culture like militarily? And looking at these sites, looking at these structures, one of the things that it tells us is that these ancient Mycenaeans were very much a warfaring people. And they built these structures with the expectation, with the understanding that they were going to be facing invasion at some point. And so they built really to accommodate that, and they did so quite effectively. This next image here is a plan view. And in the plan view here of the Citadel of Tiryns, you can see again, this is a citadel, which is a fortress or fortified city. We have the larger chamber there. You can see it's actually right where you see the number 14 in this drawing, and then to the right, that's the megaron, the throne room. Now, one of the things you kind of have to understand about this is that if you were an invading army trying to get into this building, let's say you needed to get into Tiryns and take over power and control and kill the king, whatever you needed to do. Well, that means you've got to get into the structure, and you've got to get your way all the way back to that megaron. So if you look to the right of the image, you can see where the walls open. And they create a channel to the left. And an invading group of people would pretty much really have to follow through that sequence of openings and follow through that all the way around and around and around into the heart of the structure. Well, the Mycenaeans were pretty smart about this. One of the things that they assume, probably quite correctly, is that the average soldier is going to be right-handed. And so, if you think about this, you're holding your spear or sword, but more than likely a spear, with your right hand and a shield with your left. Well, if you were to try to invade this structure, your unshielded side is exposed to the archers or other people on the walls up on the right-hand side there of the structure. They also create a series of tight choke points. So things open up and then bottleneck back down, and then open up and bottleneck back down. And these are little pockets where they could very easily trap and kill enemy soldiers. And so this is a site, a structure that is really built with these types of military ends in mind. So even though Mycenaean architecture tends to really be quite militaristic in terms of its focus, it's not without innovation. So this is an example of a corbelled gallery in the Citadel of Tiryns. And this is an early primitive form of an arch. And by the way, corbelling like this is also a technique that was utilized by the ancient Egyptians. But essentially, the way that you create an internal volume using this technique is that you start with walls on either side, and then on one of the courses of stone, you step those pieces of stone in just a little bit. And the next course steps in just a little bit, and more and more and more, until eventually those courses of stone meet. So what you end up with is essentially a triangular form, if you will. Rather than an arch, it is a triangle up on top of an open volume. And again, this is called a corbelled gallery or a corbelled space. We can see a version of this type of corbelling used here above this lintel. So what we have here is a doorway, and it doesn't look very large, but it actually is much larger than you might think. For example, the limestone relief panel up on the top there with the lions is in fact 9 foot 6 inches in height. And in a moment here, we'll see a picture of what it looked like back in the day when it was being excavated. But you have here post and lintel construction. You have these two massive posts and a lintel across the top. But if that stonework above the lintel had been solid, massive Cyclopean stone, it would have been too heavy, and it probably would have cracked the lintel. So instead, we have a series of massive stones above the posts that corbel inward. and they would have met at the top above. So the sculptural piece there, the lions that you see on either side, they are, in fact, much lighter, much less massive than the stonework used for the walls themselves. And this technique, this process, is what we call a relieving triangle. Much like the chambers that we see above the burial chamber in the pyramid of Khufu, we have a way that the stone is brought together over the top of a beam, or a lintel in this case, as a way to kind of to relieve the weight that otherwise would have possibly crushed the structure. There's a black and white photograph here. You can see the discovery of Mycenae, well, shortly after it's been, some initial excavation, obviously. But here we can see a picture from back in the day and see some of these early archaeologists and what the site looked like after initial excavation. One of the things that was discovered here, by the way, was a really unusual tomb at the site of Mycenae. And for some time, there really has been some kind of odd ideas or terms that have been applied to this structure. It's been called the Treasury of Atreus, where it really almost certainly didn't function as a treasury, though. This object, this structure we're looking at here, is what we call a beehive tomb, a tholos tomb, and this would have been used really as the resting place for the deceased. Even the name Atreus is misleading. Atreus was the father of Agamemnon, and Schliemann had a tendency to find these places and find these objects, and without any kind of proof or evidence whatsoever say, oh, well, this was Agamemnon, or this is Atreus. And so there's nothing to support that, but this is a term that just has kind of stuck today. But some important terms that we see that we need to be familiar with when we talk about this type of a structure. So a tomb like this, a tholos or beehive tomb, again, it's corbelled on the interior to create the volume. And we also have these passageways that go back into the structure, and these are called dromos. When we take a look at the inside of the building, we can see it's got this tall, peaked, corbelled internal volume. And by the way, one of the things that's pretty amazing about this, so the internal volume of this structure, of this tomb, it's about 43 feet tall. And by today's standards, that might not sound all that impressive, but remember, this is 1300 BC. And this was the largest unsupported interior volume ever made. And by the way, there isn't anything bigger for 1,500 years. It isn't until the Romans build the Pantheon using concrete that something larger, and a larger internal volume, is created. One of the most amazing objects that Schliemann discovers, one of the things that he finds at the site of Mycenae, is a gold mask. He finds at Mycenae some pretty amazing relics, to be quite honest. He finds these rich graves, these royal graves, full of all sorts of goods, including masks and cups and inlaid weapons. But this mask is probably the most famous of all of these objects. Now, when Schliemann finds this, he immediately assumes that he is looking upon the face of King Agamemnon, and he calls this the death mask of Agamemnon. Now, it turns out he's wrong. It is, in fact, about 300 years earlier than would have been appropriate for King Agamemnon. So it may have been one of his ancestors. We don't really know for certain. But it is certainly a burial item that was included in a grave. And it kind of recalls the Egyptian tradition of using a burial mask, much like we see with Tut. This was created using a technique called repoussé, which we've talked about a little bit in the past when we talked about the art of the Near East and looked at, for example, Persian metalwork. But this involves basically hammering or working a sheet of metal, often from behind, in order to create the form that you see here. This one's been quite badly damaged. It was just simply crushed by the weight of the earth over the thousands of years that it was in the ground. Another item found within Grave Circle A here is this dagger blade. And so this is inlaid with gold and with niello and silver as well. Niello is a black alloy. And so we have this beautiful scene of a lion hunt. And the artist also made really interesting use of the taller figures to the left on the wider components of the blade, down to the lions on the right as things narrow towards the tip. There's a detail here, again, gives you an idea really of just the level of craftsmanship. So this is a head, a female head, which is painted plaster, also found at Mycenae. These are quite stylized. We can see that the face is decorated with these red circles and rings of dots, and these types of facial tattoos possibly are also found sometimes in Cycladic sculpture. This could have been a guardian figure, or more than likely, actually, some sort of cult figure. So here we have an example of Mycenaean pottery. About 1200 BC, by the way, the Mycenaean palaces were destroyed either through outside invaders or internal warfare. We don't really know. But after the fall of the Mycenaeans, Greek falls into a dark age for several hundred years. In fact, they forget how to build out of stone. It isn't until later that these technologies resurface. But one of the art forms which does continue after the fall of the palace period is vase painting. And this is a crater or a bowl for mixing wine and water from Mycenae. And we have these kind of cookie cutter like images of these soldiers who are marching off to war. Another image here from about 1500 is an item which is sometimes referred to as one of the Vaphio cups. So these cups, the Vaphio cups, were found at a tomb at Vaphio, but they may have either been imported from Crete or made by a Minoan artist, or Cretan artist, really, working at a Mycenaean site. So you can see here in this image just the level of delicacy and craftsmanship. And if we look at this next image here, which is a drawing, really, of the cups, you can see the bowl motifs, you can see the background, the level of complexity of layering and design, and this is not in keeping with Mycenaean art, technique, or style. This is almost certainly something that was created by either a Minoan craftsman in Crete and imported, or created by a Minoan craftsman who had been captured by or was living with the Mycenaeans.